Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. Hey, what's up, everybody? So, last night I did an interview with the girls from the Prince and the Pervert podcast. The link for the actual interview will be in the description box of this episode. Make sure you go and check it out. If you haven't checked out their work yet, you definitely want to do that. They have a great podcast that's located in Australia, and the two gals that run it are journalists from Australia. So they have a good understanding of the case. They have a very good grasp of what's going on, and they have a very, very entertaining podcast. And I highly suggest it to all of you that are listening to this podcast. If you haven't checked them out, you definitely want to do that. They were very gracious to have me on their show last night. I was able to speak to the Australian folks, and for me, that's awesome, considering about 14% of this audience is based in Australia. So it's nice to go out to be able to talk to, the Australian people on an Australian-based podcast. So hopefully you guys will check them out. You'll give them some love. They deserve it. They're doing a great job. They're not being distracted during the whole entire crisis going on around us. They're staying focused on the Jeffrey Epstein case. And in times like this, there's not much of that. So make sure you check out their podcast, The Prince and the Pervert. It's also, like I said, going to be linked down in the description box. Now, as for today's show here on the Jeffrey Epstein Show, well, again, we're going back into the vault, folks. I could have read a story about Joe Biden's bundler, and who needs that? It doesn't add anything to the catalog. It really does not add anything to the catalog for our purposes here and for covering the whole story. I just don't feel like the situation with the donor to Biden, who is also a donor to Jeffrey Epstein, deserves a whole program. We'll talk about it a little bit more later tonight on the Daily Drop. We'll do a summary of it, but I'm not going to spend a whole episode discussing it because I don't feel it adds to the catalog at this point. Whereas this article from sciencemag.org does. This article is about the sort of researcher that Jeffrey Epstein liked to invest in. And I think it's a very important part of the story that we do not leave out this academia angle, because not only were some of these people directly implicated in abusing and assaulting girls, but they were also an intricate part of Jeffrey Epstein's facade. So it's important that we make sure that we don't forget the scientists and the professors and all of these so-called super intelligent people who were not only accepting money from Jeffrey Epstein, but palling around with him, and in some cases, even partaking in the disgusting business that Jeffrey Epstein was up to on his island and elsewhere. So, like I said, sciencemag.org is where this article was published. The author is Jeffrey Mervis, and this article was produced in September 19th, 2019. The headline: what kind of researcher did sex offender Jeffrey Epstein like to fund? He told Science before he died. In August 2017, I received an email from publicist Masha Drokova asking whether I wanted to interview her client, Jeffrey Epstein. I saw your piece on President Donald Trump's science budget, she wrote, referring to a story on the president's proposed massive cuts to research in his 2018 budget request to Congress. Jeffrey has an interesting perspective on what it will take to fill the gaps. Would you like to speak with him next week? And now, mind you, folks, this is in 2017. This is long after he did his bid. This is long after he was back in society, and he was already right back in good graces with New York's so-called polite society right when he got out of jail. And then, obviously, he was still working the backroom channels and the backroom networks to get his hands in on more of these scientific type projects so he could have more influence. You think he was just doing this out of the kindness of his heart? We know Jeffrey Epstein didn't do anything out of the kindness of his heart. Everything that he did was hoping that in two moves later it would pay off, and pay off in spades for him. Not for you, not for any of the core four. It was all about him. Why would science talk to a shadowy financier and a convicted sex offender? I queried my editors. How strange, one said. Wonder why he's seeking press now, another asked. Eventually, we decided I should accept the invitation on the chance that Epstein would say something newsworthy. And on September 8th, 2017, I reached him via Skype at his mansion in New York City's fashionable Upper East Side. According to federal prosecutors, that is also where Epstein engaged in sex acts with teenage girls during naked massage sessions. Oh, according to federal prosecutors, huh? Yeah, them, and as well as the girls themselves. Yeah, that's definitely what occurred there, okay? You don't have to be worried. Don't be timid. Nobody's going to sue you, okay, Mr. Author? Epstein began the 80-minute interview by asking me to agree, if we wrote a story based on the interview, not to use any quotes without first getting his permission. I have lots of detractors, he said, so certain things phrased the wrong way could make trouble for you and I. I agreed to his terms. I mean, really? You agreed to his terms, huh? That's nice. This author, what's his name? Hold on, let's go back and take a look here. Jeffrey Mervis agreed to Jeffrey Epstein's terms just to get the interview with him. That's what's wrong with our media, folks. I'll let you know right now, I'm not agreeing to any terms for any sort of interview. I'm going to ask the questions that I want to ask, and I'm not going to run them by anybody to make sure that they're okay. That's not how any of this works. We're not going to play that game where I give you a bunch of answers before a bunch of questions beforehand so you can rehearse your answers. No way. That's not how this game is played. Now, 2 years later, a more complete picture of Epstein's alleged predations has emerged, and last month, the disgraced financier, pedophile, hanged himself in jail after being arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking. My editors and I concluded that given Epstein's death and the intense interest in his support of science, we could quote him in this story. What follows are Epstein's views on scientific philanthropy and the experiences of a few of the many scientists drawn into his orbit. Oh, so he dies and then the sciencemag.org gets some courage and they're like, oh, now we'll quote him. This is shoddy work. You know, this is the kind of shit that makes me really agitated as an independent content creator, as an independent journalist. This doesn't fly. How does this kind of stuff fly? So 2 years later you decide, oh yeah, well I'm going to run it now after he's dead. Why were you so scared of him? Why was everybody so scared of him? I just don't understand it. It doesn't compute with me. Money I understand. In the interview, Epstein was by turns modest. I'm not more than a hobbyist in science, and boastful, but money I understand, and I'm a pretty good mathematician. He was eager to discuss his philosophy of giving and how science works. However, some of those views struck me as contradictory, and others were outdated or discredited. The overarching goal of his charity, he said, was to compensate for the Trump administration cutting back on pure research. It seemed like a grandiose claim. Although he repeatedly dodged my requests for specific amounts, his scientific donations over the past 20 years are unlikely to have exceeded a few tens of millions of dollars. That sum pales next to the U.S. government's annual research budget of $150 billion, and it's small even compared with the 9- and 10-figure gifts to science from many super wealthy individuals. Yeah, but you guys all took it, right? Oh, it pales in comparison. And oh, Jeffrey Epstein really wasn't that big of a donor to the scientific world. Yeah, right, Mr. Mervis. Millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars donated. And how much was donated behind the scenes? How much was given into the palms of these scientists? How much money was given for secrets? I asked who he chooses to fund. I'm looking for smart people who might have a great idea, he answered. I'm making a bet that certain people, not a lot of them, can do great things if they simply can be freed up to think and freed up from writing grants and having to worry about the necessities of life. Remember, I'm not building a laboratory, so my money goes to support them in a nicer way than being on a postdoc's salary. I asked him how that approach differs from the so-called Genius Awards from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, which gives out 5-year grants of $600,000 and asks nothing in return. That's completely different from Jeffrey Epstein. If Jeffrey Epstein was giving you money, he expected something at some point. It might not be now, it might not be tomorrow, but eventually you would pay the piper. I asked him how that approach differs. Oh, excuse me, we read that already. It's night and day, he replied. If you look at the MacArthur Award's origins, there were scientists like physics Nobel laureate Murray Gell-Mann on the committee looking for the world's smartest people. But over the years, big institutions like MacArthur have become politically correct. If you look at their awards in the past 5 years, they're concerned with diversity. Again, Epstein was not concerned with diversity, okay? Epstein was very racist from inside sources that I've spoken to. Epstein and his whole entire circle, they were very, very racist. They did not like minorities whatsoever. And in fact, they didn't even like poor white people. They were very sick people. It was a very sick group of people. Now, I'm all for diversity, but I'm for diversity of excellent ideas, not for diversity in the people who receive grants, Epstein continued. He seemed to view science as something done by a self-perpetuating scientific priesthood that ignored anyone not like themselves. Well, that's because the scientists in his circle, like Murray Gell-Mann and Minsky and the rest of these sick bastards, Krauss, these were all fellow travelers. These were all people who had the same predilections as Epstein, the same proclivities as Epstein. They might have not acted upon them the way he did, but these people that were around him, these scientists that these girls were given to, they were just as sick as Epstein. His next comment was even more retrograde. Now, the MacArthur grants are sort of a good citizen award for being exemplary citizens, as opposed for being a great scientist. Something you're able to tell. Being smart is the sine qua non for Epstein. So how, I wondered, did he go about identifying such budding talent? One way was to ask teachers. I talked to lots of professors, he told me, and I asked them, how long does it take you to figure out in a class of 300 who the 3 smartest kids are, he explained, and usually they'll say they know by the end of the first class. I don't believe that. I definitely don't believe that that's how it happens. And again, Jeffrey Epstein is very boisterous. We know that he was very boastful. He always used a bit of embellishment when telling his stories, right? He wasn't very truthful when telling these stories, according to people that knew him. And we see it. He was very, very bombastic, in a sense. But Epstein also thought that a science writer might do just as well. Okay, Jeff, who would you fund? He asked me at one point. You've met a lot of interesting people and talked to them. Who stood out? I demurred, saying I was a journalist, not a scientist, and that there were many people much more qualified to judge someone's scientific potential. He responded with flattery. I've listened to the way you ask questions, Epstein replied. You ask good questions. When you interview someone, you must get a sense of whether they are quick, smart, or creative, or all 3. I think that people don't trust their sense of who's smart. Epstein, on the other hand, obviously, he was just the best judge of who was smart. He was the greatest talent judge in the whole world. He was just the absolute pinnacle of finding out who the best scientists were. According to Jeffrey Epstein, anyway. When I refused to take the bait, he abruptly shifted the conversation to animals. Do you have any pets, he asked. I don't, but I offered up my adult daughter has a dog, a hamster, and several fish. Epstein plowed ahead. I'm not sure about the hamster, he responded, but if you asked if your daughter's dog was smart or not, my guess is that you'd say it was either a smart dog or a dumb dog. And it wouldn't be because you're an expert on dogs. It's just something that you're able to tell after a while. And again, this was the opinion he had of the rest of us, folks. He thought we were all so stupid. He thought everybody was so damn dumb that nobody was ever going to catch on to him. He thought that he had a beautiful mind. In reality, he was nowhere near as smart as he thought he was, and he was nowhere near as slick as he thought he was. He was being protected by people that were much more powerful than him and people that were using him. At the end of the day, Jeffrey Epstein was an object that was used and tossed away when it had no use to them anymore. Certainly my opinion on it. Tippy tip of the top. Epstein said his approach to giving was aimed at achieving scientific breakthroughs, but his view of the current state of innovation was surprisingly gloomy. Frankly, Jeff, Since the discovery of penicillin in 1928, there's been no really remarkable discovery, he said. I followed the Genome Project, and there's lots of hope. But in terms of a real product, there's probably nothing that has kept more people alive than penicillin. I can't really disagree with that. I hate to agree with Epstein on anything, but penicillin was a serious game changer. Now, I don't know if there hasn't been any, remarkable discoveries since then. I'm not qualified to make that assertion, but I will say that penicillin was a fantastic find. Epstein was quick to distinguish his approach from the path taken by others, both dead and alive, many of them with wealth that far exceeded his own. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation doesn't search for smart people, he asserted. Bill wants to cure polio. He wants to eliminate poverty. But in terms of coming up with new theories of biology or some new form of mathematics, zero interest. And I'm not going to even begin to pretend that I like Bill Gates or what he's about. I think that Bill Gates had a much more cozy relationship with Jeffrey Epstein than he likes to let on, and I think he should come forward with that information, and he should be very transparent. He shouldn't be hiding his relationship with Epstein, especially when it's going to come out eventually. He should just be very upfront about it and tell people what the deal was, because being hiding in the shadows the way he does with his in regards to his relationship with Epstein, it's just a bad look for him. It does not serve him well, and it leaves questions. And those questions, we're going to ask them. We're not going to shy away from them because it's Bill Gates or anybody. It does not matter. If you are brought up in this case and you're in court documents, or it's found out that you're very friendly with Jeffrey Epstein, especially after his conviction, then I have some questions that are going to be asked on this podcast. Epstein said he also dispensed with the accountability that typically goes with a grant. When I've given money to a scientist, they're usually somewhat surprised, and then they say, "What type of reports would you like? Is it for a milestone for my next grant?" And I giggle and say, "No, the concept is, your field best. Letting people with lots of money have input into what you do doesn't make any sense to me." I don't know if I buy that. I honestly, look, there's a reason Jeffrey Epstein wanted all of these scientists in his sphere. And of course, it had to do with his own crazy-ass genome projects and seeding of the human race with his DNA. Of course, it has to do with that. But a lot of these scientists were working on very secure projects, very projects that are classified in some cases, etc., etc. And now they're receiving money from Jeffrey Epstein, and not only receiving money, they're also being invited to his island. And once they get to the island, if they engage in any activity with an underage girl, well, now he has them. He owns them. So now, not only did he give you money, but he has video of you being engaged with minors in very compromising situations. So if we believe the intelligence angle, and I certainly believe that there were multiple intelligence apparatus at work here, not just the Mossad, but look, let's be very clear. The Mossad is the younger brother. The Mossad does not operate without the CIA being involved on this sort of scale in America. Zero chance of that happening. Just go ahead and squash that and get it out of your mind right now. The CIA is the big bad wolf, folks, okay? The Mossad, look, they have their own problems. There's no doubt. I'm not going to sit here and sing the praises of the Mossad because I'm not a fan. But the real problem in the world, in my opinion, is the CIA. Asked whose approach to charity he admired, Epstein said his sole role model was billionaire James Simmons. A fellow hedge fund manager and a PhD mathematician, Simmons has poured some of his great wealth into a foundation that supports budding mathematicians and math educators. But unlike Simmons, Epstein said he felt no obligation to help foster a more scientific, literate population. Exactly. This article is showing better than anything we've read about how he feels about normal people, the average folks. He doesn't care about a more literate population. His goals weren't for civilization as a whole. His goals were very self-serving. He was trying to find the scientists that could help him out with his goals, and the scientists also that were working on projects that were not only of interest to him, but to his people. "I'm interested in rarefied peaks," he said in response to why he hasn't funded any efforts to improve science education. "I have no insight into that area, zero. Again, I'm trying to reach the smartest of the smart. It's the same issue in terms of money. My clients are not in any way near the middle. They're at the tippy tip of the top of the pyramid. Oh, you're so special, Jeff. Isn't that great? Oh, the rest of us should just bow down to you and we should all just look up at you in awe. Meanwhile, you're the sickest, disgusting bastard in the history of the world, and the lowest, poorest person amongst us is more important than you'll ever be. The legacy you have left on this earth, Jeffrey Epstein, is one that is going to go down in infamy. Rebels who don't fit in. The researchers Epstein chose to support, it was becoming clear, fit the old stereotype of scientists whose brilliance makes them social outcasts. The MIT Media Lab is a good example, he said. The Cambridge-based university has launched an independent investigation into what its president called a deeply disturbing relationship between Epstein and the lab whose director, Joy Ito, resigned following media reports that Epstein had invested in his private companies as well as donating to the lab. And I kind of mentioned that earlier today about how it wasn't only donations on a level of, oh, all right, here you're working on a science project, I'm going to give you this money for that project. No, he was funding these guys as well, giving them money for them to, do whatever they want, to live their best lives. And again, back to the RICO situation. If they slap them with RICO, well, they'd have to trace this money, and if anyone received money from this criminal enterprise, then they're caught up in the RICO investigation as well. I would say 25% of the kids there are autistic, on the spectrum, Epstein opined. They don't really work in groups. They're not taking classes. They're not given teaching assignments. They don't have lots to do. They're there to think. I don't really have much to say about that. I have no idea how many people are on the spectrum at MIT or how operations work within the building. What I will say is this. I'm not impressed because it's MIT. I'm not impressed because it's Harvard. What, sick people don't go to Harvard? Oh, they sure do. Sick people don't go to MIT? Oh, they sure do. Just because you're smart, just because you're successful, just because you're rich, doesn't mean that that's a shield for you. That's not armor. That doesn't make me say, oh, well, he's rich or he's super smart. He couldn't be involved in any of this. It's actually the opposite at this point. Those traits appeal to Epstein on two levels. It's my natural bent to move toward the maverick and rebels who don't fit in, he noted. They were probably overlooked in school. They were definitely never class president. Such outsiders, in Epstein's opinion, are also less likely to kowtow to the scientific establishment, which he regarded as inherently conservative. He wanted people that were willing to walk a separate way, willing to dance to Jeffrey Epstein's drum and not the norms in the scientific community. He'll say all this other crap, this other garbage, oh, it was too conservative and blah, 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 blah. But in reality, he wanted people that were going to march to his tune. The older guys usually just tell you what doesn't work, he asserted. And the referees of peer-reviewed journals have also become politically sensitive. Everybody knows who the reviewer is that has turned them down because he's been asking the same question any number of times. Yet Epstein readily admitted to asking prominent members of the scientific establishment to assess the potential contribution of these so-called outcasts. So I had Jim Watson to the house, and I asked Watson, what does he think about this idea, a proposal to study how the cellular mechanisms of plants might be relevant to human cancer? Watson is a Nobel laureate and co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Likewise with Noam Chomsky on artificial intelligence, he said, referring to one of the pioneers in the field. Isn't that nice, huh? Noam Chomsky hanging out with Epstein, another guy that likes to yell down from the rooftops about how he's so much smarter than the rest of us and how none of us know how civilization's supposed to work. Meanwhile, he's palling around with Jeffrey Epstein. Remember that next time you quote your boy Noam. In fact, Epstein expressed great respect for the opinions of these elder statesmen. It's funny to watch Noam Chomsky rip apart these young boys who talk about having a thinking machine, Epstein noted. He takes out a dagger and slices them very kindly into shreds. Nobody cares. I've never liked Chomsky anyway, and this puts an even worse taste in my mouth about the dude. We know Chomsky was a sick dude probably as well, right? All of these dudes that were running together, at the very least, they were enabling Jeffrey Epstein. So you can miss me with the Noam Chomsky bullshit from here on out. A notorious name-dropper, Epstein clearly savored his access to scientific superstars. As you might know, I was very close to Marvin Minsky for quite a long time. I funded some of Marvin's projects. Yeah, you also provided a young girl for him to abuse. Remember, Marvin's one of the people that Virginia has named directly. He said about one of the founders of artificial intelligence, a longtime MIT professor who died in 2016. And Marvin told me there was this young guy in Germany who had a very unique idea about artificial intelligence. Or this. So I was just with Roger Penrose, a distinguished theoretical physicist who leads an institute in San Diego, California. And Roger told me about an Indian woman physicist who has come up with the idea of using a Bose-Einstein condensate, a collection of supercooled atoms, to find gravitational waves. Again, with the name dropping, so has anybody talked to Roger Penrose about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? Maybe I should get on that. Maybe I should figure out who Roger Penrose was and what his relationship to Jeffrey Epstein was when he was accepting this money. There again, like I said last night, reading the Daily Beast article when they were talking about how one of the survivors slapped a RICO suit on top of her civil suit. I had no idea about that, and that's the same here. I'm not familiar with Roger Penrose in this story, but that's why these drops and these daily updates are so important, because we unearth things that we might have missed. I let them decide. Epstein said he usually gave out his money anonymously because he had no interest in publicity and because he understood that his notoriety might be a burden to grantees. It's not really a secret, but it's private, he explained about his gifts. I let them decide. If you want to tell people you got it from me, fine. If you prefer not to for your own personal reasons, that's okay too. Come on, really? Jeffrey Epstein wanted everybody to know who he was giving his money to. Now, maybe after the fact, he was a little bit more coy about it, but the overall idea remains the same. The reason for him giving this money remains the same. The reason for him funding these scientists remain the same. I wondered how the recipients saw it. The researcher Minsky had flagged for Epstein. Joshka Back declined repeated requests from me to discuss his ties to Epstein, but a 2018 paper on his theory of consciousness acknowledged support from the Jeffrey Epstein Foundation, and Bach has been listed in media tallies of Epstein's grantees. Bach represents the type of scientist for whom Epstein claimed his money can make a big difference. You don't have to think about money for the next 5 years, Epstein said he told Bach as the researcher prepared to move to MIT's Media Lab in 2014. Epstein says Minsky helped arrange the appointment. Minsky is a huge part of Epstein's scientific weight. Minsky was one of the big dogs that had Jeffrey Epstein, that really gave him credibility in the world of science, because everybody respected Minsky as a scientist, and when he vouched for Epstein, well, the rest of the boys came on board. And once Epstein was there, and once he started talking to them and drawing them into his bubble, well, money, access to girls, etc., that story talked to these folks. 2 years later, Bach moved to Harvard University's program for evolutionary dynamics, which was founded by Martin Nowak, another beneficiary of Epstein's charity. In February, Bach left Harvard and became vice president of research at the AI Foundation based in San Francisco, California. For Seth Lloyd, a self-described quantum engineer, taking Epstein's money initially seemed a no-brainer. Already a tenured MIT professor, when he met Epstein in 2004 at a party hosted by his literary agent, John Brockman, Lloyd was charmed by Epstein during several subsequent meetings at Harvard. Mr. Epstein offered me a grant to do research, which I accepted, Lloyd wrote in an email after declining to be interviewed. He seemed to like my work on ideas of information and computation being the fundamental substrate of the universe. Lloyd received additional donations from Epstein in 2012 and 2017 to support his MIT lab. There are lots of topics in this field that were not funded by other grants, Lloyd notes. Last week, MIT President Rolf Reif acknowledged signing a thank you letter sent to Epstein after his 2012 donation. And again, both of these donations in 2012 and 2017 were after he had been arrested. And for Seth Lloyd to take that money, it's gross. Seth Lloyd is an absolute disgrace for taking that money. Last month, however, Lloyd publicly addressed the ethical issues involved with taking Epstein's money. In an August 22nd blog post titled, "I am writing to apologize to Jeffrey Epstein's victims," Lloyd related how the job of a scientist is to look for truth and the job of a teacher is to help people to empower themselves. "I failed to do my job on both counts." Yeah, the apology is all fine and well, but you knew what he did and you still took the money. My comment stands. Lloyd, you're a piece of garbage, buddy. Sorry. It would be very tempting. Yvette Fuentes is the physicist whose work on detecting gravitational waves Penrose described to Epstein. But unlike Bach and Lloyd, Fuentes says Epstein's name immediately raised a red flag. For the record, Fuentes grew up in Mexico, not India, and did her PhD at Imperial College London. Penrose and Epstein had met at a June 2017 conference on the science of consciousness in San Diego. Although the topic of consciousness is not what I do, when I saw the list of speakers and was offered a plenary talk, I decided that it would be a good thing for me and a good audience to hear about my experiment, says Fuentes, a professor at the University of Nottingham in United Kingdom whose work is supported by the Penrose Institute. Shortly after returning home, Fuentes says she and Penrose had a conversation. Would I be interested in receiving funding from a wealthy man who had been convicted of a sex offense? Fuentes recalls Penrose asking her. Penrose shouldn't even be asking this question, especially to a woman. Penrose should be ashamed of himself, and he definitely needs to answer some questions. Fuentes immediately said no, citing ethical objections, and quickly forgot about the conversation. But 2 months ago, after reading that Epstein had been arrested, she called Penrose. Was it Epstein, she asked him, and he said, yes, I think it was. And I said, oh God. Fuentes is hoping to get a few $1,000,000 from a European funding agency to build a prototype of her project, a room-sized version of an existing facility, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory that has cost the U.S. National Science Foundation more than $1 billion. Epstein's money might have accelerated her work, but that was never an option for her. Well, yeah, and it shouldn't be. Your work will be more respected by doing it the old-fashioned way, getting donors who actually have, good intentions when they're giving you that money. They actually want to see the science moved forward. They actually want to see people do a good job, and they want to see the world be a better place. That was never Epstein's motivation with these scientists. That was never what he was about. The dream of my life is to build a gravitational wave detector and have it work, she says. So if someone were to say to me, I'll give you the money to make your dream come true, it would be very tempting to say yes. But then you have your ethical standards. Even if you lose some opportunities, saying no is the right thing to do. What Epstein has taught me is how important it is to do that. You should have taught everybody in the science world about that at this point. Nobody should be taking money from people like Jeffrey Epstein. It doesn't matter the walk of life, and it doesn't matter the purpose of this money. Guys like Jeffrey Epstein should have been completely and utterly ostracized after his first arrest. He should have never been able to come back into polite society. He should have never been able to continue with his criminal enterprise. But so many people, like these scientists and others, gave him the credibility and offered him a vehicle to insert himself back into public life. And the survivors are still left waiting for justice. All right, everybody, if you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All right, everybody, I'll be back later on with a daily drop.